Welcome everyone to the week 3 go-to session. So this is the third of 4 go-to sessions we're holding this month. The good news, we're halfway through the course, just a little bit more than halfway through. So yay! We're also kind of winding down. Um, the next few weeks are a little bit lighter in some ways, so you won't have to analyze any more presentations. There is one more discussion board activity that occurs next week, but it's peer review. We'll talk more about peer review in next week's go-to session. But even though it's a discussion board activity, it's directly connected with your actual presentation. And I'm going to begin there. Okay, so it's sort of like last week. I want to begin with the main activity you're going to work on this week, and then we'll get into some of the more sort of big picture concepts that you learned about in your readings for this week. Okay, so here's the FSO platform, and there's really only one graded activity here this week. Okay, there's some other sort of optional discussion boards you can participate in. Um, but the main activity here is this 3.4 assignment. Okay, it's basically the first draft of your actual presentation. So we've been talking about the presentation a lot from week to week, but we haven't actually started working on it. Although in some ways you have, because you handed in your planning document last night by midnight, it was due. I'm going to try to work as hard as possible tonight. I might even end up burning the midnight oil, working until 2 or 3 a.m. to try to get those graded so you can get feedback and use that feedback as you work on your presentation. But yes, the main activity for this week is to actually create your presentation. So I'm going to bring up the assignment sheet for that, which I have open here. Now, this shouldn't be your first time looking at this assignment sheet, because if you'll remember for the planning document that you just handed in, remember you had two sets of instructions. You had the actual instructions for that activity, but you also had this assignment sheet. Because how can you plan out your presentation if you don't yet know what the presentation is all about? True, I've been sort of hinting and being actually more than hints. I've been pretty specific about what the presentation needs to focus on. But yeah, the assignment sheet goes into a bit more detail. So this should not be the first time that you're looking at the instruction sheet for the presentation. And really, I'm going to point out a few things here. Point out a few things here on the assignment sheet. But your main task is really pretty simple. It's to create a draft of your presentation. And again, as you can see, I've skipped down, by the way. There are other pages here, but I'm skipping to the instructions. Remember, the same thing I've been echoing all month, right? We're working on a 3 to 4 minute presentation that's aimed at prospective employers. You're going to imagine you're a recent full sail graduate. Okay, so in some ways, a good way to think about this is, and maybe this will become the reality as we keep becoming more technologically advanced. Imagine a world in which the job you're applying for, yeah, maybe there's an interview sometime down the road, but they want to sort of look through applicants by requiring them to submit a 3 to 4 minute presentation. So essentially, you're sort of pitching yourself to prospective employers. If you keep that in mind, that's really what the presentation is about. Um, which direction do I want to go in? Actually, I'll come back to this stuff, these bullet points, in just a second. And let me talk generally about the assignment. So, yes, you're creating your actual 3 to 4 minute presentation. This means that you're going to open up whatever tool you identified in your planning sheet. So maybe some of you will use PowerPoint, maybe some of you will use Keynote or Prezi, maybe some of you will tackle a different tool, perhaps make a short film using video editing software, or manipulate video editing software to create a presentation. So whatever tool you've identified that you'd like to try out and use, you're going to start opening it at this week. Okay, you're actually going to create your presentation. So this means that, yeah, you're going to create your 3 to 4 minute piece. It's due by Sunday, so we're back on track in terms of Sunday due dates. And then next week, everybody's going to post their drafts to a peer review discussion board so you can look at each other's work and offer detailed feedback. Okay, what's working well, what could be improved, etc. But yeah, the main task is really just to create that 3 to 4 minute presentation. Um, I do want to see as much in place as possible. Okay. Um, Remember that they're basically, I think it's useful to think about it in two halves, right? So there's the visual component. Um, it might be images. Typically, it's images that students use. Um, Essentially, kind of what the material that will be on your actual slides. Even if you're using a specific tool that doesn't use slides, still I'll use the word slides to sort of generically refer to whatever's appearing on screen. Okay, so there's a visual component, and then there's your carefully scripted professional voiceover. Um, so yeah, you should have as much of that in place as possible. Now, and by the way, I am encouraging people to have perhaps that voiceover in place, but let's say you don't have it in place. Um, it's fine, for example, to have, let's say you're using PowerPoint, okay, and you carefully put together your slides. Um, but maybe, I don't know, time has run out, or you still want to work on your script. Still, you can provide me with what you think your script is going to be. In PowerPoint, you have a notes function where you can add notes. Maybe I should open up PowerPoint real quickly. And by the way, I'm not saying that everybody has to use PowerPoint. Um, I think in a previous session, I even encouraged people to take risks and try out a different tool. Um, if you want to go for it. But if I open up PowerPoint real quickly, okay, and for now, I'm just going to pick a blank slide, okay, because I don't really care about the slides, the quality of the slides or the themes at this point. Um, Here, let me blow this up a little bit. And as I've been talking about all month, I mean, this is a problem with presentation software, right? It sort of encourages the sorts of presentations that we're working against this month. It encourages you to already click here and add a title. It encourages you here to click more text. And that's why so many presentations are text heavy and they're not typically very engaging. They're often not very pretty to look at because presentation software often sort of invites that kind of automatic or even lazy sort of presentation creation. But I don't want to get into details of that right now. I just want to show um, you have different layout options in PowerPoint. And okay, that's not the right tool. Here, outline. Okay. But you have the ability to click and add notes here. So, for example, let's say you don't get around to recording your actual voiceover. I mean, it would be great if you do, and I'm going to encourage that because the more that you have in place, the more that your peers and I can give specific feedback. But certainly, you can have, let's say, all the visuals in place here. And then in your set of notes, have your carefully prepared script, what you think you're going to say that accompanies this image, and then I can give feedback. So yeah, your goal here is to really create a full functioning draft of your presentation. Let me get away from this for a second. In terms of recording, let's see. Actually, let me keep that big for a second. If you go under, I believe it's slideshow. Yes, you have this function here, record slideshow, and just record. Clicking on this allows you to record um, audio to accompany the slide. So that's where that function is. And then you can always look over your work, which I recommend doing because sometimes you'll find that your voice is either too soft or it's too loud, or sometimes students fold in background music or background sounds, but their voice is getting buried. So be sure that you always listen to your actual work to see how well it's coming across. But yeah, you have these basic abilities to, for example, record audio to accompany your slide. Okay. And if you're not using PowerPoint, again, I'm not saying that everybody has to use PowerPoint. Other tools have similar functions. Okay. Um, so that you can have your voiceover accompany your presentation. But yeah, if you don't have the voiceover in place, at least give me your carefully sort of scripted delivery in the form of notes. What I want to avoid is occasionally, students will give me 3 or 4 just general slides. They slap some images on the slides. There really aren't any notes. I don't have a clear sense of what's going to accompany each visual, and that just makes it difficult because then I can't really give much specific feedback. Okay. And if you have questions along the way, things are kind of silent right now. Yeah, go ahead and ask any questions that you might have in the chat, okay? Because they might occur to you as I'm talking here. Now, if we get back to the assignment sheet, what you have here on the page here for instructions to the right, or in this bullet list, are thought questions. And be very, very careful, because sometimes students get a little bit confused, and rightly so, because you just completed a planning activity where you sort of had to go through a list of bullet points and answer them specifically and with care. But for this presentation set of instructions, these bullet points are really just thought questions. And you even get that indication up here: to prepare for this assignment, research the following questions and make notes to help plan your presentation. So you get questions like, what is your target industry? What are some interesting points about the industry? Why do you find them interesting? Again, these are thought questions for you. The idea being that if you think through these questions somewhat carefully, hopefully there will be a lot buzzing around in your brains, that when you're creating your presentation, you're drawing upon that wealth of knowledge because you spent a lot of time thinking about what your prospective employer would want, or you've thought about what members of your industry find interesting. Okay, but these aren't literally questions that would appear in your presentation. Every so often, a student hands in a draft, and the presentation begins with, "My target industry is music production. Next slide. Here are some interesting things about my industry." And of course, that doesn't make any sense, because this presentation is aimed at prospective employers. Okay, if I'm working for a record label, or some other organization that deals with sound, or I'm looking to hire someone with a music production background, even if it's not a record label, I already know what the industry is, right? You don't have to tell me that your industry is music production, because that's a given, considering that you're um, reaching out to that industry. Some of these do apply, perhaps, to your presentation. Like, you very well might cover in your 3 to 4 minute presentation your future, where you see yourself heading, but literally you wouldn't explain what your next steps are after graduation, because you're already imagining yourself as a recent Full Sail grad. Okay, so again, these are thought questions for you to mull over, so that you can hit the ground running when it comes to having lots of ideas floating around your head when you create your presentation. Okay. um, and if the instructions seem open in general, that's kind of on purpose, because we don't want to set an absolute script for you to follow. We don't want to teach like a template. We're not teaching you resume writing or cover letter writing. Okay, you have the ability to discuss what you wish in your 3 to 4 minute presentation. I think there are some pretty essential things to include, and they're kind of hinted at on the next page of the assignment sheets. Okay, be sure to address the following as though you have already completed your degree. How are you unique? How will you excel in this industry? What knowledge or skills have you mastered during your education? Okay. What are your unique interests? And then other things that you would probably touch on. What specific skills do you have? What specific accomplishments do you have? And here again, because we're asking you to imagine yourself a couple years in the future, you've already graduated. It's fine if you want to list as accomplishments things that you see yourself realistically completing during your time at Full Sail. So if you don't know, you might look at your upcoming classes. You might look or try to find out what sort of projects you'll work on. So, for example, if you're a film student, it's fine to imagine that before you leave Full Sail, you'll have, I don't know, created a short film, and you can invent details. Like, I would give that short film a title. Um, you could give some explanation about what the film was about and what you learned during your creation of the film. Okay, so those sorts of details you can invent. Um, the only advice I'll give here is that they should be realistic details. I had a female student 2 months ago who was in music production, and her accomplishments included producing music for Nicki Minaj and Taylor Swift and Kanye West, even though that kind of does make sense, because Kanye West entered the industry as a hotshot music producer. I don't think he really needs outside help very much. But you can see the other big problem there, right? Like, how realistic is it for someone who's maybe 23 or 24, just graduating from school, to already have that kind of list of accomplishments? So, yes, you can realistically imagine the sorts of things you will learn and accomplish over the next few years, but keep them in the ballpark of reality, okay? Um, but yes, you can feel free to list accomplishments that you haven't yet finished or completed. Okay. And I'm not going to read through the rest of this, but I'm just going to encourage you to take a close look at the assignment sheet and make sure that you're reading all things thoroughly. So you get some notes here as you develop the presentation, right? Be sure to use skills processes developed throughout the month from your readings from these go-to sessions. So the things that I strongly look out for is that all month I've sort of been beating the same drum, that we're sort of trying to break bad habits of just opening software presentation and slapping words and bullet points on slides, because that's not terribly interesting, right? I've been echoing the same information all month, that we're using simple, effective visuals and allowing those visuals to act as sort of anchors for what's truly important, which is your professional scripted voiceover. Um, and some other notes, use a tool that you are familiar with, or at least feel comfortable with, or are willing to learn. Okay, make sure that your presentation is fresh, effective, and reflective of your career field. We're going to talk in a bit in a moment about some sort of big picture concepts you learned this week from the readings that should hopefully make your presentation more engaging. Um, okay, so and again, I think I've said this before, but it's not that I'm grading so heavily on how slick your presentation is or how talented of a graphic designer you are, but I want to see that you're at least addressing sort of like the big concepts we've been talking about all month. Again, breaking those bad habits. Simplicity, right? That we're creating engaging, attractive looking presentations, yes, but it's actually rooted in a sort of elegant simplicity, um, rather than just choosing a template in PowerPoint and sort of mailing it in. Um, okay, before I get into sort of the big picture concepts that came from the reading, do I have any questions at this point? I hope my voice is coming through. I see my levels moving. For some reason, this week's a little bit quieter in terms of people not making comments. Do people feel comfortable with what I've just covered in terms of expectations for the draft? You can just quickly type yes or no in the chat. If you type yes, that will make me feel super happy, and I'll move on. Griffin says yes. Okay, good. Everybody else says yes. Joshua says, I think so. Ron says, I made it very clear. Okay, good. Because I do get a little bit frustrated. I think, not to criticize the assignment sheets, but I think they could be more streamlined. There's lots of information lurking in different places, and it can trip students up. And like I said, it's purposely an an open-ended assignment, because we don't want to teach only one way to create a presentation. So you actually have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to include and how you want to present it. And I know that sort of open-endedness can be frightening, but don't let it scare you. Joshua says, I'm right to assume that it is a bit of pretend. Yes, I mean, I would say that it's some of it is some of the details might be invented, but I think it's a little bit different than flat out pretending. Like I said, the woman who went a little bit crazy, imagining that she's already producing records for Nicki Minaj and Iggy Azalea and whoever else you mentioned, Taylor Swift, like that's we're in fantasy land at that point. Uh, but yes, and by the way, I don't think listing accomplishments that you realistically see yourself completing over the next couple of years, I don't see that as complete pretending. I mean, yeah, maybe you're inventing some of the details. So if you say, uh, for my final project at Full Sail, I created an app, or I created a short role playing game. And yeah, if you have to invent a title for it, or give some details about that project, okay, sure, that's a little bit invented, but it's still within the realm of possibility. It's still accurate in terms of anticipating the sorts of things you could accomplish here. Okay. Okay, let me get into the big picture concepts. This will probably be a shorter session. That's another good thing, is as we wind down, the week 3 and week 4 sessions are a bit shorter. So let me just go over a couple points here. Okay, so today we're really going to talk about the actual content of your presentation and how to make it as impactful as possible. Oh, and by the way, and I know I've repeated this ad nauseum, but again, I mean, I'm trying my best, even in these go-to sessions, to sort of follow what I preach, or excuse me, practice what I preach. So again, I mean, I'm using what I think is a simple and effective video, right? This crater, uh, right? We think of craters, excuse me, a meteor hits the Earth and leaves an impact crater. So what a great metaphor! Our content, the actual information in our presentation, also hopes to make an impact. But look, effective visual, attractive to look at. It's not that you can never use text, but the text I'm using is pretty minimal. And the real focus is on the words I'm delivering to you. Um, and if you think back to week one with those TED Talks, I mean, those are also very, very effective examples where, sure, the presenters might have had slides or visuals of some sort, or maybe even props, but the real focus was on them. Right? I mean, they walk out on a stage and they sort of own the stage, and you're carefully focused in on what they're saying. They don't just have slides that are sort of standing in for them. Okay, as I've been repeating all month, our focus is on our audience. Again, this is actual, not theoretical. You can eliminate a lot of potential snafus or pitfalls if you're really putting yourself in your audience's shoes. I think I've given examples of this in the past, right? Sometimes students, and at the draft stage, I really don't get, like, I don't take off points for it or something, because it's my job to give feedback. But sometimes the students accidentally overshare, or I was born in Oklahoma City in 1984, and then my parents got divorced when I was 12, and I felt lost, and it was then that I went into my bedroom and started playing guitar. And and maybe there's some aspects of that that could be turned into a pretty powerful anecdote to perhaps explain how the student fell in love with music. But maybe some of the details could be left on the cutting room floor. Like, I don't need to know what year he was born, things like that. But if we think really about our audience and their needs, that will help us determine, like, what sorts of information they would want to hear and what sorts of information they wouldn't. So one big piece of advice I give is, when you have a draft of your presentation in place, I mean, really sit down and watch it. Okay. Or if you don't have the voiceover completely recorded yet, imagine the voiceover that's going to accompany it, and imagine that you aren't you. Okay, so who's in our room now? Griffin, Jason, Joshua, Ron. Like, imagine that you're not Joshua. Imagine that you're not Jason. Imagine that you're that person who's in charge of, bringing the next music production person on board, bringing the next web designer into the organization. Okay, and pretend that you're that person. That will help you spot lots of moments where things feel like they're either off topic or it's just too much information. But we can spot those things if we put ourselves in our audience's shoes. Um, by the way, I taught business writing for a number of years, and in some ways, it's very similar to what I would teach in that class. For example, students had to write resumes and cover letters, and I would teach them very basic tricks, like when it comes to the cover letter, that they need to remember that 100 applicants are all saying the exact same things. They're explaining where they went to school, they're explaining their work experience, they're explaining the skills that they possess. But I would teach them very, very audience centered tricks, like, for example, do research into your company. Okay, visit the organization's website. Maybe there's an innovative program they have. Maybe there's something unique that they do that other places don't. I mean, how cool would it be that you can actually mention that in your cover letter? Again, that's a good example of putting yourself in your audience's shoes. If you're someone who has to go through 100, 200 cover letters in a day, you'll suddenly sit up a bit straighter, maybe even have a smile come across your face when you find that there's actually an applicant who's saying something different than everyone else, and actually showing that they care about the organization because they've taken enough time to research it. Now, this project's a little bit different. Okay, you're not creating a cover letter, but I still think that if you put yourself in that mindset of what would your prospective employer want to hear, like, what can you bring to them? um, and Nancy Duarte talks about this in both books, actually, Slidology and resonate. I believe it's in Slideology that she talks about how too many presentations are essentially data dumps, right? The person comes out, she or he has information to provide, and they just provide it. And that's not often the most effective way to reach an audience often wants to, they're looking for something very, very specific. And the more that you can anticipate that, the more that you can craft your words, craft your presentation so that it seems tailored for them. Yes, it's about you, but it's about presenting yourself in a way that allows your audience to imagine how you can fit within things, right? Within the company, within the organization, etc. So anyway, I'm sorry, I got a little bit off track there, but this is actually a good segue. Oh, and my cursor just disappeared. Hold on. There we go. I often have to minimize the presentation, then open it up again, and my arrow is still not appearing. Hold on. Maybe if I just drag the control panel over here. The problem is I get blocked and I can't see the slide. Anyway, I actually got off track there, right? I was sharing kind of a personal story. I was mentioning how I taught business writing. I was talking about the importance of audience, and that's a nice segue because one of the things Nancy Duarte stresses quite often in both textbooks is this idea that stories are powerful. You might have a story to share that's not about you. Often stories will take the form of personal anecdotes. Remember that that's a really, really powerful tool that you can use. You only have 3 or 4 minutes to work with, so you can't tell a 2-minute story. But maybe there are things that have happened in your life. Maybe beginning with a short personal story or an anecdote is a terrific way to begin your presentation. Because not only does it capture your reader's attention, everybody loves stories, but maybe it's a way that naturally introduces your material. I was sort of joking or teasing about the student or presenter who overshares, but maybe there is a way to share a concise, focused personal anecdote that doesn't overshare but does really bring to life like what it was that got the person excited or inspired by music. And maybe that short anecdote will be the perfect way to sort of lead into, and now I want to bring that same excitement to your organization. So storytelling is a powerful tool that you can rely on. We talked a little bit about this in week 1, but I think it's a good thing to keep in mind that presentations like stories or like plays have a 3-act structure. There's a beginning, obviously there's a middle, and there's an end. So you might want to think in terms of those chunks, like how are you going to begin your presentation? Okay, we've already talked about one technique, a story or a personal anecdote. There are other ways, right? Maybe there's something going on in the news right now that relates to your industry, or maybe there's a shocking or surprising statistic, uh, I'm trying. You would think I would have an example off the. Oh, here's one that a past student used. A student looking into the music industry. He shared a fact about just how much the record industry has declined. I mean, that's a pretty dangerous thing to mention because maybe record labels don't want to hear about that. But he was able to use that sort of shocking statistic as a way to say, however, I still believe in the future of the music industry, and I'm excited to work for this company, and I'm eager to join this team and take this organization forward. So yeah, referencing something that's currently going on, or sharing a personal anecdote, or maybe making a reference to something in history, or beginning with a powerful quotation. These are all really terrific techniques. I will say, however, that they're lousy techniques if you just use them generically. Like there's nothing worse than someone who's quoting something but clearly doesn't really care that much about the quote. um, Hopefully you have some ideas in mind. For example, maybe you know of a quote, or you know of something that you heard your industry role model say, and then you head out to find it. But yeah, if you're just going to like one of those quotation websites and generically picking one, that might not be terribly powerful, or sharing an anecdote that doesn't really have any point, or referencing something from history that you don't really care much about. So yeah, all these techniques can be awesome, but they become a little bit less than awesome if you're using them generically or mechanically. So the idea here is not just to use these techniques, um, perfunctorily, which is just a fancy word for mechanically. The idea is to really find the right and natural and uh, God, I'm stumbling over my words today. To find that connection that really speaks to you. That's what I was trying to say, right? You're trying to find your right move into the material. And if you can do that using one of these techniques, then that can be really, really awesome. The middle of your three act structure, yeah, it's going to contain probably the meat of your information, your skills, your qualifications, your accomplishments. Don't forget that you can still fold in some of those other techniques in the middle of your presentation as well. One other quick piece of advice I'll give about mentioning your skills, qualifications, accomplishments is that you should be able to come up with the sorts of things that, I think I might have said this in a previous session, but you should be able to come up with the sorts of things that a big dummy like me couldn't just come up with. Okay, so I think we have a lot of music people here. Uh, but yeah, you should have very, very specific skills, for example, related to music production that you know about, or specific tools or software that you use. If you're in film, same thing. If you're in web design or digital design, the same thing. I say this because sometimes students, when they get into discussing skills and accomplishments, they list very general things like, I'm a hard worker, or I'll give it 110%, or I always show up to work on time. And you can easily spot the issue, right? I mean, these are the sorts of generic comments that could apply to any job, whether you're going for working as a door greeter at Walmart, nothing wrong with that, by the way, uh, or a salaried position within your industry. So yeah, you should be coming up with the specific sorts of details that not just anybody can invent, right? I know very little about your fields, so you should be coming up with the specific information that I couldn't just come up with off the top of my head. And finally, yeah, you'll have to think about an ending. How should you close things out? You can use a lot of these same techniques as a way to close your presentation as well. Um, or there's a nifty trick that sometimes you can begin with, for example, a story and maybe save the conclusion of the story for the end. That's a nice sort of way to bookend the presentation. But yeah, thinking about things in terms of having a specific and distinct beginning, middle, and end. Um, okay, there's this concept that's known as a critical moment or a star moment. And I need to apologize because I actually meant to cover this in last week's session because it did show up in your planning document. And some of you might have been a little bit surprised or confused when you got to the planning document and saw that it was asking you, what is your star moment? And maybe you thought, well, I don't know. If you were keeping up with the readings, you would have learned what a star moment is anyway, but it was also on me to present that. So I won't really be grading that part of your planning document too strenuously. But real quickly, yeah, the star moment, and here's another powerful visual. It stands for something they'll always remember. It's this notion that there will probably be lots of good parts in your presentation, but ideally there should be one part that you're really excited about, like a move that you make, whether it's your opening move in terms of sharing a short anecdote, or maybe later you make a unique comparison. But there should be a moment that stands out because lots of presentations and if you think back to the TED Talks, a lot of them tend to have it. There's usually a moment or two that really stands out. Okay, that you walk out of the auditorium, or if it's an online presentation, you finish watching the presentation and log off, and that moment just really sticks with you. So you might want to think about, do you have such a moment in your presentation? If you've kept up with the textbook readings, Nancy Duarte gives lots of good examples. She shares an instance in which Bill Gates, who, as you know, no longer is the head of Microsoft, he spends most of his time working on philanthropic causes now. Uh, but during one speech where he's trying to raise awareness of health concerns in Africa, specifically malaria, he began his talk by walking out on stage with a jar filled with mosquitoes and then unscrewing the lid and releasing the mosquitoes into the crowd. Like, that's a pretty big star moment, right? You'll remember that. I assume that the mosquitoes really weren't carrying malaria. But yeah, it was this sort of shocking attention-getting move because, as your textbook explains, Bill Gates wanted to communicate this idea that, hey, this is a problem that we think is, thousands of miles away, but those people aren't the only ones who should be suffering. You should get a taste of what this suffering or what this fear or what this anxiety is like as well. So he made that really flamboyant move. Your star moment doesn't need to be flamboyant. You're not. Again, you're not creating a TED talk. You don't have to do something that outlandish. But is there a moment in your presentation that you think really sort of stands out and that you're proud of? Okay, again, I can't see what's on here. We can think of star moments as kind of falling into the 5 different types. There are probably more than 5, but these are pretty big ones. I just described sort of a memorable dramatization. This is something that typically is acted out. Okay, I don't know if any of your TED Talk presenters did this, but sometimes a presenter might do something shocking or begin with a bit of comedy, something that's actually acted out, something that's grabbing the audience's attention in terms of what the presenter is actually physically doing on stage. Probably this isn't going to apply to your presentations. Most students do not appear on camera for the presentations. If they do, they appear very briefly. Most of you guys are going to be behind the scenes. Second is this idea of repeatable sound bites. It's an awesome technique, and it's one that sadly I don't see students make use of very much, even though it's mentioned in the textbook, and I'm stressing it now. But repeatable sound bites is when you purposely, as the expression indicates, repeat something again and again by design. In your textbook readings, the author gives the example of Steve Jobs introducing one of the previous iterations of the iPhone. And he specifically and purposely kept using either the phrase reinvent the phone or some variation on that, right? We're reinventing the phone. This is a reinvention of the phone. And it's not an accident. He keeps repeating that phrase throughout the presentation because he wants it to stick. Think of the way that advertising sort of worms its way into your brain. You can do the same thing in your presentation by repeating sound bites. Other good examples come from politics, and that's always dangerous because the current political climate is so toxic. So I don't want people weighing in on their opinions of different leaders. But think of like President Obama's "Yes, we can," right? Like there's a repeatable soundbite, one that you remember. I want to be fair. I'm trying to think of one that comes from the Republican side of the table. That's okay. I have an example of Reagan who appears on a slide in just a few seconds here. But yeah, repeatable sound bites are awesome, and I wish students would make use of it more. We've already talked all month about evocative visuals, okay? So finding that right visual, and again, I think I tried to show this in my presentations. Find the right image, an attractive image, an image that accompanies what I want to say. We already discussed storytelling, so don't forget about that popular technique. And finally, the use of shocking statistics. Maybe shocking is too strong of a term. Excuse me, I had to, again, collapse and reopen the presentation. It doesn't necessarily have to be shocking. It may be surprising or interesting would be a good substitute for an adjective. But yeah, and I'll give an example in the slide in just a second about what form that could take. Could people hear that? I have my computer's volume pretty loud, but I don't know if that came through or not. And I don't know, is anybody in my age range? I'm 44 years old. Do we have any people here who are old enough to remember President Reagan? We have lots of young people at Full Sail. I'm not getting any answers, so maybe I'm the only old person here. Anyway, Jason says he remembers Reagan. Okay, so yeah, there was this famous moment, right, where the Berlin Wall came down. Okay, Germany used to be divided into 2 halves, communist East Germany and the democratic West Germany, until the late 1980s, where the wall came down because sweeping changes were happening throughout Europe. the fall of communism in general, and eventually it even would occur in what was formerly the Soviet Union, right? They also ditched their political commitment to communism. Anyway, this isn't a history class, but during the coming down, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, Reagan had his famous moment where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Joshua says he remembers his grandfather talking about this. Okay, so that's like another thing. There's a really carefully crafted, by the way, politics is a great example because speechwriters work very, very hard to create these sound bites. Okay, and they could actually also be considered star moments because we remember this moment. We remember this line from Reagan. Other famous examples, right? JFK. Um, I always screw it up when I try to remember it. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Okay. You don't have to come up with something that witty in your presentation. I just want to stress the idea that be aware of how you're crafting things. You have this ability to come up with unique ways to say things or to repeat uh, certain concepts on purpose during the presentation. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to skip this because we've talked about visuals all month long. And just to reinforce this, like this would be an old school slide, right? The person is just opening up software and slapping words on a slide. Like this is what you can imagine. More than 2,000 tropical forest plants have been identified by scientists as having anti-cancer properties. Okay, interesting factoid. But it becomes more powerful if you can pair it with the right image. Okay, things kind of change. Things become more interesting. Now the audience gets to look at the visual and what it communicates, along with the power of the quotation and what you, the presenter, might have to say about that. Okay, we've already talked about storytelling. I don't know if people noticed, but I sort of jumped in the discussion board for week 2 with inspirational presenters, and I actually picked this talk by Susan Cain called The Power of Introverts. I certainly don't require you to go back and read my post. It was pretty long, but I got into it because I really love this presentation, and it's a terrific TED talk. But she does a really great. She makes great use of storytelling. Okay, she shares an example of a memory from childhood when she was at summer camp. She shares an anecdote about the death of her grandfather, and they occur naturally and they're powerful and they relate to her overall theme and talk. Obviously, you're creating a much shorter presentation that isn't tackling giant themes. You're actually just presenting yourself to a prospective employer. But you can use the same techniques in I think smaller forms. Here's a good example of a surprising or shocking statistic. Okay, and again, my control panel is blocking the slide, so give me a second to move it and then reopen. Um, this comes from Steve Jobs. We are selling over 5 million songs a day now. Isn't that unbelievable? 5 million songs a day. That's 58 songs every second of every minute of every hour of every day. There are actually 2 techniques going on here, okay? There's the surprising statistic, okay? 5 million songs a day and what that translates it to. I forget. I don't even remember the actual fact, but I forget how much content is uploaded to YouTube every day. Like it's a ridiculous amount. So sometimes, yeah, surprising statistics can work well. But this is also a good example of a repeatable soundbite. Again, look at that last line. That's 58 songs every second of every minute of every hour of every day. Okay, that's not accidental. Okay, it wants to hammer home that structure every to reinforce a sort of surprising nature of that statistic. So realize that you have that in your arsenal as well. Okay, I'm going to kind of breeze through this part, not because it's not important, but because I do want to wind things down. Just just a quick reminder: there are these fancy Greek words. Ethos, pathos, and logos. And I do think it's kind of helpful and interesting to know in general what they mean because they do have a tangential relation to your presentation. Let's start with the 2 on the right, okay? Because they're the easiest to explain. Pathos is the appeal to emotion, right? That one of the ways we can reach people is by appealing to their emotional needs, right? By tugging on their heartstrings. Extreme examples of this would be, for example, have you ever seen those really sad commercials with Sarah McLachlan? I think it's for the ASPCA. You've seen them, right? All the sad dogs and cats caged up, and there's really sad music playing, and then it goes on forever. Like you try to switch to another channel, and then think, wow, it must be over now, and then you go back, and it's still going. Like that's pathos. Logos is, of course, is the exact opposite of that, and that's why we have the picture of Mr. Spock there. It also shows that I love Star Trek. But yeah, logos is the appeal to logic. Okay, so that's the part of us that loves facts and statistics and charts and graphs. And it's not that one is better than the other, that both actually work really well together. So, no, you're not going to be trying to make your prospective employers cry, but there are subtle ways in which you can maybe get them excited or make them interested, right? But at the same time, sometimes it is important just to deliver factual information. What are your specific skills? What have you accomplished? And the one on the left is the hardest to explain, ethos. It's just the general sense of credibility or trust that you create, and it's created just by every choice you make. Whether you're writing a paper or whether you're delivering a speech, whether you're creating a presentation, it really is, do you trust this person? So again, if you think about the TED Talk presenters, most of them have pretty strong ethos, right? They seem knowledgeable. They seem trustworthy. They seem to know what they're talking about. We have this feeling that they're intelligent people, that they're experts. Ideally, you should be communicating that same sense of strength in your presentation, okay? And this is so annoying. My computer is not working the way I keep getting blocked from seeing what's on the slide. But yeah, just real quick, I'm not going to read all these out loud. But for example, pathos, it includes things like, yeah, do your words evoke feelings? But it's not even just the tugging on heartstrings. For example, how are your visuals? Are your visuals powerful? Okay, that's related to emotion and feeling. And then logos, we've already talked about that, right? You'll probably be pretty straightforward in your listing of skills, accomplishments, qualifications. And then ethos, again, is your presentation put together in such a way that your audience respects you? Do they believe in what you say? Are you trustworthy? Okay, so all that kind of stuff. I'm going to skip through these slides because it's just repeating. I have to ditch some of these slides and make things more streamlined. But if it helps you to look at these questions real quickly, there they are. Okay, so yeah, ethos. Are you coming across as a well-rounded, serious, responsible, trustworthy candidate? Remember that funny picture I showed from your textbook Resonate of that real slimy, goofball-looking dude with the whiskey tumbler in one hand and the sunglasses and the open shirt? Like that doesn't communicate a strong sense of ethos. You don't want that person communicated when you give your presentation. Okay, we are winding things down. Yeah, there's always room for improvement. So you're going to get feedback from me. You're going to get feedback from your peers in week 4, and hopefully you'll take it seriously and use it. Okay. But yeah, that's a good thing too. Is that it's not that I want to see your strongest effort in your draft, but the good news is it's a draft. Okay, so you're going to put forth your strongest effort, but you also have time to go back and revise it and improve it for week 4. Because you've heard that cliche over and over again, right? About the importance of a first impression, or you only get one chance to make a first impression. That's true here too. I mean, sometimes cliches are cliches, and sometimes cliches are powerful because they communicate an essential truth. Just as you wouldn't show up to a job interview wearing stained sweatpants and a dirty T-shirt, your presentation should be communicating who you are at every level. Right? We talked about branding last week, about how ideally you should already be thinking about who you are as a unified person, what sorts of values you want to communicate about yourself, what sort of character you want to project out into the world. I mean, that's part of your impression building. But so is all aspects of the presentation. So, for example, and I must be doing a pretty good job because I get fewer and fewer bad presentations at the end of the month. But yeah, occasionally I still get that presentation where the student, for example, is just winging it. They're not working from a script. The voiceover seems like it was just invented on the spot. What kind of impression does that give? So yeah, you can make an impression in your presentation just as you could in person. Right. And here's a quote from Nancy Duarte to reinforce that. The audience learns a lot about you based solely on how you appear the first time. And oh boy, don't we know how that's true. It seems unfair when it comes to jobs or especially your love life, right? You don't get a second opportunity to make a first impression. But sadly, that cliche is so true. Okay. Questions, comments, complaints. Well, no complaints. Yeah, that's essentially the stuff I wanted to go over today. I really wanted to talk about these sorts of different strategies, these different tools that you have in your warehouse that you can draw upon. So we're not just data dumping on our audience. And if you've been keeping up with the textbook readings, you've been getting examples and more thorough explanations there as well. But do we have any questions at this point? Okay. Really just one activity to complete this week, which is the actual draft of your presentation? Or is everything perfectly clear? If so, that would be awesome. If you are confident and you're happy and you don't have any confusion and you don't have any questions, I'm not going to force you to stick around. You're allowed to go enjoy the rest of your evening. Okay, there's a presidential debate tonight. Maybe some of you are into that. I'm torn between watching that and the Cubs Pirates game, which is about to begin in a few minutes. I'm going to hang out for a few moments. So if there are questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat. But if not, again, thanks so much for attending and enjoy the rest of your evening. And I'm going to stop the recording now.